So we're going to talk about Federalist number 70 from Alexander Hamilton. This is his continuation of kind of the powers of the president and titled The Executive Department Further Considered. But really the topic that we get into with Hamilton and what he's trying to describe is why we need a single executive rather than a plural executive. So it's about a unified executive. So one of the things that Hamilton's talking about here is that many people were worried about the president having too much power vis-a-vis the other branches of government. Again, our experience with Great Britain and King George, we were a little concerned about giving the president too much power. But in Federalist 70, what we see is Hamilton making the argument that, in effect, in order to be able to have a good government, we had to focus on the idea of having an energetic president. In other words, the president could get things done. And he says, energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. And to quote directly from Federalist 70, he goes on to say, it's essential to the protection of the community against foreign attacks. It is not less essential to the steady administration of the laws, to the protection of property against those irregular and high-handed combinations which sometimes interrupt the ordinary course of justice, to the security of liberty against the enterprises and assaults of ambition, of faction, and of anarchy. Again, see that word faction there that could develop in legislative politics. On the other hand, he says this, a feeble executive implies a feeble execution of the government. A feeble execution is but another phrase for bad execution, and a government ill executed, whatever it may be in theory, must be in practice a bad government, right? So then he goes on to say here, really kind of a slap at the anti-federalists, taking it for granted, therefore, that all men of sense will agree in the necessity of an energetic executive. Let's go through the reasons why, right? So he really kind of slaps them in the face and says, this isn't really something that we need to discuss, but I'm going to discuss it anyway. So for Hamilton then, in order for us to have an effective government, and if you kind of read between the lines here, a government in which we have a serious series of separation of powers and checks and balances to be able to deal with the overwhelming power of the legislative branch, the president has to have enough investment in the office and enough kind of formal powers in order to be able to be successful vis-a-vis the other branches of government. So there were 4 ingredients that he introduces here in Federalist number 70 that deal with this idea of an energetic president. The first one is unity of the executive, meaning that we need to have just one person that's the president. The second is the idea that we're better off if we have a long duration for president of about 4 years. There was some discussion about 1-year terms or 2-year terms, but 4-year was particularly with the ability to be able to get reelected. The anti-federalists were concerned about that, but says in his introduction that will come later in the next couple of papers, really talking about the idea that we have to have a president who's invested in the office, invests their personal kind of political capital. Otherwise, the president would be nothing more than a figurehead and wouldn't really be interested in checking the other branches of government. The third thing that we need for an energetic government is the ability to be able to have a salary so that they're not dependent upon Congress for money to be able to live. And then finally, adequate powers. We need to invest the president with the powers in order to be able to check the other branches. The primary one of these powers, of course, for the discussion in the Federalist papers later on will be the idea of having a veto. But just going back to our focus here on Federalist number 70, Hamilton's most concerned here with Federalist, with the idea of unity. So there are a couple of things that he talks about here. He says we really are in a best shape with a single executive because the executive branch in and of itself needs to have decisiveness, secrecy, speed, and action. It needs to be able to move much faster than the legislature or Congress in this case. And then he goes through and talks about, well, what are the other options that have been thrown out there? And the two options that were being discussed were one, having a multiple executive, or using kind of the model that had been used in Pennsylvania with having an executive council and then one person kind of being the leader of this, or the first among equals. But nonetheless, the executive council would be a number of people that made decisions. And he says, here's the problem with that. The problem is that if we want decisiveness, secrecy, speed, action, and also accountability, we're not going to get that with multiple people. So he says, look, whenever you have multiple people making decisions, you're going to have people with differences of opinion. And that is going to ignite factions around those opinions, which may prove to be something that's very divisive and, in his estimation, splits the community. And again, just remember all of what we know about Federalist number 10 and the concern about factions and constructing a government that is not hostage to factions, but rather controls them. We understand the importance in the Federalist Papers of the need to stop factions. So by having a plural executive, we'd actually be promoting factions. So that wouldn't be a good design of government. Second of all, we have the problem of holding people accountable within either a multiple executive, or particularly in the case of the executive council with a single executive. And what Hamilton's talking about here is that, essentially, how do we know in the context of a group decision-making process who's responsible for different outcomes? People would not own up to bad outcomes. People would be split and say, this was my idea, this is somebody else's idea. How do we have kind of that situation in which, to quote Harry S. Truman, the buck stops here? We don't know who's accountable, and that's a problem. And then finally, the idea that with a multiple executive in some form would have a difficulty in reaching a timely consensus. And here's where I think, Hamilton makes a very excellent point. He goes back and says, look, you say, well, our legislature is designed for deliberation. And to quote Hamilton, he says, in the legislature, promptitude of decision is oftener an evil than a benefit, right? So we want deliberation. We've designed that to be bicameral. We've designed it to necessarily have a bunch of balances in the legislative branch. But once it gets to the point of executing the law and carrying it out, we don't want that kind of deliberative process to work in the same manner, because it needs to work more quickly. So at the end of this, basically his argument is that all good people, all smart people can all agree that we want a single president. And of course, that is, at the end of the day, what the founders decided to do in the Constitution.